Thank you, Aradna, for this quick presentation. While you enjoy your lunches, I'll spend the next 18 minutes or so giving a bit of input on how I've seen development cooperation change over the last 15 years, but also trying to give this TED Talk a bit of a personal twist. I think we don't always have to dive into very technical terminologies, very project-oriented issues. I think sometimes we should also reveal a bit ourselves about our personalities, where we come from and where we're heading. So basically my TED Talk today, in a nutshell, I will try to present my personal work-life journey over the past 15 years since I educated from university. But I will also, hopefully more importantly, try and connect some of these personal experiences with the work of Helvetas, try to connect some of my experiences with the kinds of processes that Helvetas finds herself in at the moment, in terms of strategy development, in terms of identifying itself afresh as an international NGO. So hopefully during my quick presentation, my TED Talk, I'll be able to give some pointers on human resource development from my point of view. I would also talk about the work-life balance, which is something that has actually been radically changing my life over the last 5 years since I started observing it. I will also talk a bit about how I have been involved in change management processes, both in terms of strategy development, but also in terms of turning one of the big tank ships, a big Danish INGO, into a new INGO, similar to the discussions we're having now with Helvetas on our futurability. So futurability of INGOs will also be part of my presentation. Basically, I only have 4 slides. The first one, it's pretty obvious where we will start the journey when you look at the colors and the dressing on the picture. So very brown, very 1970s. So basically I want to start about where did I find my motivation, my drive actually to work with development cooperation. And believe it or not, it's actually something that goes quite a long way back from where I grew up in, well, I wouldn't say it's the wrong side of the tracks, but it's definitely the part of the city in Denmark where I come from, where the so-called ghettos were found. Actually, 3 years ago, our previous government actually branded them ghettos, but we just saw them as where we lived, just normal public apartment blocks. I come from Aarhus. This is the second biggest city of Denmark. It's basically the same size population-wise as Bern, about 300,000 inhabitants. But the school I went to at that time, we had already about 20 to 30% of immigrants from a range of different countries. Eritrea, France, Laos, Turkey, already quite a multicultural setting. I think actually now it's the other way around. It's 20% ethnic Danish, so to say, and 80% with migrant backgrounds. But at that time, it's before the whole political narrative started talking about us and them. At that time, in the 70s, early 80s, it was basically just, if you talked about us and them, it was more about the rich against the poor, not against each other in terms of ethnicity. So we grew up, I would say, and went to school in a very harmonious way. And I always found it quite interesting how come Tesfaye had joined the class, where did Tao come from, what is her background. I was always a bit intrigued about that, trying to find out the reason behind it. And at the same time, Danida was very, Danida is basically the Danish pound down to Swiss Development Corporation. At that time, in the 80s especially, Danida had a very big component of public awareness. So on kids TV, every day there would be actually basically programs about development cooperation happening in the global south. Of course, this has changed now in Denmark, but I think in general there's not a lot of these awareness programs. Of course, we have different social media channels, but I think at least those kind of programs really brought my attention to development cooperation, and saw that some of my school comrades, they were actually here because of war, they were here because of poverty, they were there because of social injustices, economic injustices. So for me, it's something that has always stuck deeply in my heart, my motivation to join development cooperation. And I think it's very important for us when we meet crisis in our work life, always to remember, why are we here? Why did we join? And do we still want to be here? And I think also a very important point of my life journey was to define my own pathway. I was at a quick age or early age always told by my parents that you're very special, but they meant it in different ways. My father said you're very special, meaning that you're so weird. Why don't you want to be a bank manager like me? Why don't you want to stop talking about high school and just go and get some money? That was his development pathway for me. While my mother said you're very special in the sense that I was different in a positive way. So it's also about overcoming the social hindrances that you find in your formative years. It's about sticking to what you want to do, what you believe in. And basically I rejected the ideas of my father, and I did apply for high school, and even worse, I ended up in a university. So I think only until recently he realized that, okay, maybe it wasn't a complete wasting of time educating yourself. But anyway, better later than never. So basically, my studies were also quite targeted. I studied political science and African development studies. And I also had some jobs in the Global South in South Africa, and also the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Denmark. What I want to say is basically my neatly planned career pathway, at least academically, met a very rude awakening in 2002, when I finished my studies. I was so ready to go. I knew that there were these Danida opportunities for young advisors to travel to the Global South. But 1 month before I finished my master's degree, we had a new government, a new liberal government came in, and the first thing they did was to cut development aid, quite significantly. I mean, in a Danish context, it was from 1% to 0.7%, so that was really dramatic. So basically it meant that all the jobs disappeared. So I had a choice. Should I just be patient, try and apply for the few opportunities that there are, or should I try to deroot myself and start something else? So I chose the other way. I waited, and after I took 1.5 years to find my first job opportunity. But when I got it, I was more than thrilled, because I knew that this is basically what I always strive to do. So this is a picture from where we stayed in Zambia, in rural Zambia, about 5 hours away from the nearest supermarket. This was an area that would have power cuts at least 20 to 30 hours per week. We would have elephants, hippos, monkeys, black mambas in the garden. So it was really the kind of experience that you could only imagine that you would have. I was there to function as local government advisor. Mind you, I was just fresh out of university, more or less, after 1.5 years being unemployed. But to be honest, this is really when my education started. So I functioned as local government advisor for 5 years, working with the local district council in this part of Zambia, working with local communities for them to get closer to the local council and to participate in decision-making processes. Very similar to what we still do in our governance and peace work today. In Zambia, I think also this is when I had my first whiff of what we also call systemic approaches. First of all, my partner was a system partner, but also what we tried to establish was with inclusive systemic approaches. So I think already 10-15 years ago in many development corporations, including Helvetas of course, we did actually start on these inclusive systemic approaches. So when we now talk about our futurability, we should always remember that it's not completely new what we are doing. We're perhaps trying to consolidate what we have been doing in the past as Helvetas. But basically, I think also when you go out as a new development worker, it's of course to achieve your own goals, it's to contribute to the development of that particular country or that particular district. But I think also it's something that international donor agencies need to think a little about in future, where does the recruitment base come from? And I see a tendency globally that there are less and less of these kind of development worker positions where you're actually allowed to get out and get your first experience and really learn something. And that's a shame, because we sort of have the risk of having a new generation that didn't have the opportunity to travel, to really be in the field for not just 6-8 months, but really substantially be in the field for a lot of years. So I think this is something that is getting lost in international development cooperation, and I see a big peril in that trend. I would also say that when you do development work in the South, it's not always about achieving the Lockframe. We are very Lockframe fetishist, I think, in development cooperation in general. It's almost becoming the only way of doing things, of programming and implementing and monitoring things, but there should always be scope for adaptive management. So actually, spending 5 years in Iteshi was the name of the place. I'll test you afterwards if you remember the name, Iteshi. But the biggest achievement had nothing to do with my job description. The biggest achievements were around establishing a new community radio station, which is still the biggest and most effective in Zambia to date. It was closed down during the recent elections because it was in an opposition area, but it's a community radio station that I'm really proud of. We also started some natural resource management programs, and all of this came together under one big program umbrella of Danida. But at the end of the day, it's about welcoming new challenges as a young development worker, and also be flexible in what you think you're supposed to do, and you end up doing something else. So, what happened next? Yeah, then after 5 years in Zambia, I was asked if I wanted to be country director in Kenya for the same Danish INGO. And I said, yeah, why not? I'm only 35, but I guess it can't be that difficult, can it? And in many ways, it wasn't. Because if you have a good system and support in place from head office, from your colleagues in the country, it can all work out. But actually my functioning there was actually not to develop a new strategy or transform the organization into a new organization. It was actually to merge the organization with ActionAid International. Because at that time, we are now around 2008, 2009, my Danish organization had decided to join ActionAid International, which is a big international federation of, I think, about 45 member countries at the moment. So they had undertaken a process where all their country programs, they used to be country programs like we have country office in Helvetas, had become equal members on equal footing of this bigger federation. There was a process where they had to graduate. They would have to establish their own board, their own strategies. They would have to mobilize their own resources. But this was an international strategy that MS, my Danish organization, now called ActionAid Denmark, thought was the way forward. Because we were only in 9 countries, we were doing a good job in those 9 countries, but really, in terms of leverage, high-level impact, there was still a lot to be done. So we joined this global federation, and I can say that change management processes at a country office level can sometimes be quite difficult. And I think many persons, when you talk about change management, become a bit eerie, they become a bit uncomfortable, while other personalities embrace change. And I think as we're always in continuous change management mode in INGOs, we need to recognize that some people deal with change differently than others. What I can say from my experience is that what is important is that you have a leadership with a clear vision, which is decisive, and actually do not drag on too long with change management processes, because I think you can also get a bit tired of change management mode all the time. So it's very important, I think, that everybody in a change management process sees themselves in the new organization and they see themselves contributing to the process. If you lose people on the way, they can quickly become quite pessimistic and end up blocking the change management process at hand. So, I started at this point when I finished my doings in Kenya. We had merged the organizations quite all right within a year and a half. I started getting lost in management, and I was really bad at observing my work-life balance. At that moment, I had been called back to Denmark to function as international manager for governance in the whole Federation of Action Aid. I was doing that quite okay, but then there was crisis in Action Aid Sweden. I was asked to be general secretary in Sweden part-time together with my management job in Denmark. Oh yeah, and by the way, could you also be director of knowledge in Denmark? Because, you know, we are good with governance in Denmark and we need to sort of get a fingerprint in Action Aid Federation. So basically I had 3 jobs at the same time. I was now 37, 38 and still fresh, 20 kilos lighter than now. And I said, yeah, why not? Let's go for it. And I actually moved to Sweden. I left my wife behind in Copenhagen. And I think this is where things started really sliding down for me. Within a year and a half, I had about 700 overtime working hours. And as part of a management contract, these were just my contribution to the organization. I think also what really hit the nail on what hit the head on the nail was when we started doing humanitarian responses in Syria. Mind you, Action Aid Denmark was a very traditional Danish INGO, very similar to Helvetas, and we had 0 experience in humanitarian responses. I was called up a Sunday afternoon during the summer break, and my Secretary General, let's go for it, he said. So I don't think we really have the capacities to do it. We had a regional program in Syria, Jordan, Lebanon and Egypt, but it was doing youth campaign work, so what does that have to do with humanitarian responses? Anyway, the Secretary General, he decides, and we went ahead. And I think I found myself a few months later in the Zaatari refugee camp in Jordan, thinking, what the hell am I doing here? I don't believe in what we're doing. I don't think we're ready to do it. And my mother, she actually just passed away 1 week earlier. And I had still said goodbye to Denmark and said, okay, maybe I'll see you again, maybe I won't. And I will never really apologize that to myself. I can't. It was one of the biggest regrets of my life, that work had really taken so much control over my life that I didn't even stay behind for saying a proper goodbye. So, also just to say with Helvetas, I think what we're doing with humanitarian response, it looks really good. Let's also take time to really make sure that we are ready to do it. Certainly I don't want to end up in a situation like I was in my previous work. So anyway, just to wrap up my talk, I still have a few minutes, I think. I decided to quit my job from one day to the next. Well, my social life, I decided to quit my 3 jobs. And my Secretary General said, well, you can't, because you know, we will need 4 people to replace you. I said, well, that's not really my problem now. But anyway, we had a gentleman agreement that I would stay behind for 1 more year to hand over. But then again, you're already a dead man walking, because when you lose your stars on the shoulder, you also lose presence and profiling in an organization. The other way around as well. I think sometimes when you then move up in the ranks, people start listening to you. So I think this is something we always need to remember. It doesn't matter what rank you are in an organization, you always have something important to say. So I just felt that dynamic changing around me, and I didn't really prefer being a dead man walking as well. One thing was to be overworked, but being a dead man walking was also maybe not what I wanted to spend a year on. So one morning I woke up, I looked at the internet. The first job I saw was advisor for Helvetas in Switzerland. I had no clue about Helvetas. I said, well, anyway, I used to work in Switzerland in '92 as a Kellner. Maybe it could be good to go back. So a few months later, I found myself in Bern. And really, that was when I could reinvent myself. I wrote here catharsis. Maybe it's a big word, but that's how it felt. I really felt that my energy came back. My lust for work came back, but also my big lesson learned was to observe work-life balance. So, in short, this was a TED talk about always being adaptive to organizational changes. It's about checking yourself all the time, keeping it real. If you don't feel that you are convinced by the theory of change or the objectives of the organization, take a moment to reflect upon it. But also always be ready to be resilient to all these changes. They will never stop, and adapt accordingly. So I hope that you could see a bit of connections to Helvetas, but this is where I come from, and I'm still very much in Helvetas, and I am a Helvetas with a big H in my heart. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to working with all of you.